The first thing the Marines saw of Iwo Jima was the mountain. Mount Suribachi rose out of the ocean like a dark tooth, surrounded by low, ugly hills and a band of black sand that didn't look like any beach they had ever trained on. It wasn't soft and welcoming. It was volcanic ash, deep, hot, treacherous. Every step would be like walking through dry mud, every sprint a slow-motion nightmare. Somewhere under that mountain, and inside those hills, tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers were waiting. They had spent months carving the island into a layered fortress, tunnels, bunkers, artillery caves, hidden firing slits that watched every possible landing zone. They weren't planning to stop the Marines at the water's edge. They were planning to bleed them dry, yard by yard, until the invasion choked on its own losses. On the American side, the plan looked simple on paper. Massive naval bombardment, rows of landing craft, waves of Marines hitting the beach, pushing inland, crushing resistance with numbers, training, and firepower. But paper didn't show the critical details: the black sand that would swallow boots and vehicles, the invisible firing points set just high enough to look down along the beach, the overlapping arcs of machine gun fire that turned every flat surface into a killing zone. Inside one of the landing craft, packed shoulder to shoulder with Marines, the air was thick with diesel fumes, salty spray, and the kind of silence that only exists when everyone is trying not to think about dying. Helmets clinked. Dog tags tapped lightly against chests with each shudder of the engine. Someone tried to crack a joke and gave up halfway through the sentence. There was nothing funny about the way the artillery shells walked closer and closer across the water. Most of the men clutched familiar weapons, M1 rifles, bars, carbines, standard gear they had trained with until it felt like an extra limb. But one man, standing near the front of the boat, held something that did not belong. It looked too heavy, too stripped, too brutal to be anything issued by a quartermaster. It had the long, lean lines of an aircraft gun, the rough wooden shoulder stock of a rifle, and the insect-like legs of a squad automatic weapon bolted underneath. Cables, clamps, and handmade fittings tied it all together. It was ugly. It was beautiful. And it was in the hands of Corporal Tony Stein. The officer up front shouted orders that were mostly swallowed by the noise of the bombardment. "Get ready. 30 seconds." The usual phrases bounced off steel and nerves. Men checked their weapons one last time, even though they had already done it 3 times since the boat left the transport ship. Some thought about home. Some thought about the training films that showed clean landings and textbook advances. Tony thought about angles, arcs of fire, and how long his improvised weapon could sustain a burst before the barrel begged for mercy. He knew what waited for them on that beach. Briefings had made it clear this was not going to be another island where the enemy died in dramatic banzai charges. Here, the Japanese would stay underground, let the Marines pile up on the sand, and then open up with everything they had from positions that bombs and shells had barely scratched. A normal squad with normal weapons would be chewed apart before they could even identify where the worst fire was coming from. That was why he'd brought the Stinger. The Stinger wasn't its official name. Officially, it didn't exist. There was no line for it on any equipment list, no neat designation in any supply log. It was a field creation, a crime against regulations, and a love letter to raw firepower. An aircraft Browning AN-M2 that had no business being on a human shoulder, married to scavenged infantry parts by Marines who cared more about surviving the next landing than obeying every paragraph of the manual. Tony had helped build it. He had watched it come together piece by piece in a makeshift workshop. A stripped gun from a damaged aircraft, a Garand rifle stock reshaped to fit a receiver it was never meant to touch, bipods taken from a bar, a jury-rigged trigger, and sight setup designed to work not at 10,000 feet but at ground level, in the dirt, under fire. He knew every pin, every screw, every spot where the metal had fought back under the file. He also knew its price. The Stinger fired fast, blisteringly fast, faster than the standard infantry guns. That meant blisteringly fast ammo consumption. It would eat belts and boxes like candy. He would have to move to feed it. And on Iwo Jima, moving meant stepping into a landscape designed to kill anyone who stood up. The landing craft jolted hard as a nearby shell sent a geyser of water slamming against its side. A few Marines flinched, some swore, one made a sign of the cross. Tony shifted his grip, feeling the weight of the stinger once more. This was not the workshop now. There was no time left for adjustments or clever ideas. There was only one question. Would this ugly, improvised monster do what he believed it could do? Punch a hole through a beach that was never meant to be survived? A thin line of gray light appeared at the bottom of the ramp as it began to grind open. The sounds outside flooded in, the high, angry buzz of machine guns, the distant thuds of mortars, the endless crash of naval guns firing from far behind. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Every man in that boat knew that as soon as they stepped forward, their lives depended on speed, luck, and the thin layer of steel and fabric they called combat gear. Tony did not wait for someone else to go first. The instant the ramp slammed down and the black sand came into view, he surged forward into ankle-deep surf, stinger in his hands, eyes already searching for the first target. Behind him, the rest of the squad spilled out into the open, but for a few crucial seconds, he was alone in front, a single figure moving toward a beach that was screaming at him to stop. He didn't stop, because if he did, the stinger would just be another piece of metal. To matter, it had to speak. And on Iwo Jima, the only language that changed anything was fire. Corporal Tony Stein did not look like the kind of man comic books would put on the cover. He wasn't a giant, he didn't have movie star looks, and he didn't give fiery speeches. He was compact, quiet, and moved with the relaxed confidence of someone who knew exactly what his hands could do with metal, tools, and machinery. Before the war, Tony had been a machinist in Ohio. His world was one of measured cuts, precise fits, and unforgiving tolerances. If a part was off by even a fraction, the whole machine could fail. That kind of work shapes a person. It teaches patience, discipline, and a special kind of pride. The pride of making something that works perfectly when it absolutely has to. When the war came, Tony traded his workshop apron for a Marine uniform, but he didn't leave his mindset behind. On the rifle range, he treated his weapon like another machine that could be understood, improved, tuned. On earlier Pacific islands, he watched standard gear fail under mud, heat, and constant combat. He saw guns jam when they were needed most, magazines run dry at the worst possible moment, and good enough equipment get men killed. He wasn't a complainer. He was a fixer. If something didn't work, his instinct wasn't to curse it, it was to take it apart and make it better. That instinct would become the difference between just another Marine with a rifle and the man who carried an aircraft gun into one of the hardest landings of the war. On paper, the Marines were well armed. They had the reliable M1 Garand, the hard-hitting bar, the sturdy .30 caliber machine guns, flamethrowers, explosives, everything an army needs to crush defenses. But the war in the Pacific kept proving that standard issue wasn't always enough against an enemy who lived underground. On island after island, the Japanese didn't just dig foxholes. They built networks of bunkers, concrete pillboxes, and tunnels that let them fire, disappear, and reappear somewhere else. A machine gun nest could be buried so deep in rock that artillery barely scratched it. A rifleman with perfect aim meant nothing if all he could see was a dark slit in a hillside. In that kind of battlefield, speed of fire mattered. Whoever could throw the most lead in the shortest time had a better chance of forcing defenders to duck, even for a moment. Rifles were accurate, but their rate of fire was limited. Bars were solid, but still not brutal enough to erase an entrenched position in seconds. The heavy machine guns were powerful, but too bulky to rush forward with the first wave. Men like Tony saw this gap. There was room for a weapon that didn't officially exist, something with the firepower of a plane's guns, but the mobility of a man on foot. The manuals didn't mention that. The battlefield demanded it anyway. The idea started where many dangerous ideas start, around men who were tired of seeing their friends die. On a Pacific airfield, damaged aircraft sat in rows, waiting to be stripped for parts or written off entirely. Inside, some of those planes were Browning AN-M2 machine guns, slim, light, and built to spit bullets at a furious rate from the wings or nose of a fighter. To most people, they were just aircraft components. To a few Marines, they were an opportunity. Someone asked the question out loud, what if we could carry one of those? At first, it sounded like a joke. The AN-M2 wasn't designed for infantry. It had no stock, no bipod, no way to comfortably aim from the shoulder. But jokes have a way of turning serious when desperate men do the math between survival and firepower. In a makeshift workshop, a tent, some crates, a table stained with oil and sweat, the experiment began. They took an AN-M2 from a scrapped aircraft. They grabbed a wooden stock from an M1 rifle and reshaped it to fit the receiver. They pulled a bipod off a bar and bolted it to the front. They rigged up a trigger and sight setup that would work from the ground instead of from an airplane. It wasn't pretty. There were rough welds, sharp edges, and spots where the metal looked offended at what was being done to it. But when they loaded it and fired a test burst into a berm, the gun roared like it had always wanted to be free of the wing of a plane. The recoil was harsh but manageable. The rate of fire was insane. Someone called it a stinger, and the name stuck. There weren't many of them, just a handful of hand-built beasts. One of them ended up in the hands of Corporal Tony Stein, who looked at this illegal improvised monster and saw not a problem, but a solution. Back on the landing craft rushing toward Iwo Jima, the Stinger felt heavier than it had on the test range. Not because the metal had changed, but because of what it now represented. This wasn't a toy or a side project anymore. It was a promise that if the enemy tried to lock down that beach with machine guns, at least one Marine would answer with something even louder. The boat slammed through the surf, jolting every man inside. Spray flew over the bow as shells landed uncomfortably close, sending pillars of water into the air like giant fists. A few Marines looked at Tony's weapon with a mix of curiosity and doubt. Some probably thought it was overkill. Others thought it was crazy. Tony didn't care. He only cared whether it would work. "Stand by!" The shout cut through the noise. The ramp began to lower, slow and grinding, revealing a slice of gray light and chaos. The moment every man had been both dreading and waiting for finally arrived. The ramp crashed down. Instantly, the front of the boat was hammered by enemy fire, bullets snapping past, sand kicking up where rounds chewed into the beach ahead. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to freeze. Then Tony moved. He stepped off the ramp first, boots splashing into the cold Pacific water, Stinger already coming up into his shoulder. Behind him, Marines surged forward, some stumbling under the weight of their gear, others half blinded by smoke and spray. But for those first seconds, he was the point of the spear. The sand grabbed at his feet as he pushed up the beach. He could feel rounds snapping past, sense more than see the invisible lines of fire tearing across the open ground. Instinct and experience told him where the worst of that fire was coming from. A slightly elevated position, a subtle flash, a pattern in the way men were dropping. He dropped to a knee, planted the bipod, and aimed the Stinger toward the unseen teeth of the first bunker. The beach of Iwo Jima had been designed to kill him. Now it was time to see if his stolen aircraft gun could kill the plan. He squeezed the trigger, and the Stinger finally spoke. The Stinger's voice was not like the others. Where rifles cracked and bars thumped, the Stinger screamed. It spat a continuous stream of fire that sounded closer to an aircraft strafing run than a man with a gun in the sand. Hot brass poured from the side of the weapon in a molten cascade, clinking and hissing as it hit the black beach. The barrel blazed, flashing with every round sent downrange. Tony rode the recoil, muscles tensed, feet digging deeper into the ash as he dragged the muzzle across the narrow opening of a Japanese firing slit. Inside that bunker, the defenders had been confident. They had perfect fields of fire. They had rehearsed their roles, knew the range to the shoreline, and had probably expected that any American who stepped into their zone would be cut down like grass. They had not expected this. Bullets slammed into the face of the position with furious density. What had been a stable firing point suddenly became a storm of splinters, chips of rock, and lethal steel fragments. Even if Tony couldn't see the men inside, he could feel their surprise through the way their fire faltered, stumbled, and finally went silent. For the Marines behind him, the effect was immediate and obvious. The deadly stream of fire from that bunker, the one that had pinned them to the edge of the water, dropped off. The killing lane in front of them didn't become safe, but it became survivable. They sprinted forward, diving into shallow craters and folds in the sand, using every inch of chaos the Stinger had just bought them. Tony didn't pause to celebrate. He shifted, searching for the next muzzle flash, the next subtle flicker that marked an enemy position. The beach wasn't just one bunker. It was a network of them, all overlapping, all ready to reopen the slaughter the moment pressure lifted from any single point. He swung the Stinger, picked a new threat, and opened fire again. The Stinger was powerful. It was also hungry. At its blistering rate of fire, ammunition vanished in seconds. The weapon that gave Tony the power to shred bunkers also threatened to leave him dry at the worst possible moment. His first belt ran out with a harsh, empty click. The gun stopped, and the battlefield roared back in around him. Enemy fire, men shouting, the sound of bodies hitting the sand. He didn't have the luxury of lying there and wishing for a resupply ferry. If he wanted more fire, he would have to go get it. Tony sprang up and ran back toward the waterline, toward the rough ammo points being established under what little cover the terrain allowed. On the way, he saw what the Stinger had bought. Marines alive who would have been dead, a gap in the wall of fire where there had been none before, men crawling and sprinting instead of lying still forever. Halfway back, he spotted a Marine lying awkwardly in the sand. For a second, his brain labeled it as just another body. Then he saw movement, a hand, a shallow rise in the chest. The man was alive. Barely. Tony didn't hesitate. He slung the Stinger, bent down, and hauled the wounded Marine up onto his shoulders. The extra weight turned every step into a battle against the sucking sand and the shock waves of nearby explosions. But step by step, he dragged both himself and the injured man out of the worst of the fire. At the supply area, he dropped the wounded Marine into the care of corpsmen and grabbed fresh ammunition as fast as his hands allowed. Belts, boxes, whatever he could carry and still move. Then he turned around and went back. Forward, firing. Back, carrying a wounded man. Forward, shredding another firing point. Back, bringing someone home who would have died without him. He didn't do it once. He did it again and again and again. By the time people tried to count, they would say he made around 8 trips under fire, each time bringing someone out and bringing more ammunition in. On a beach that was supposed to be a one-way journey for many men, Tony turned himself into a shuttle between life and death. Rumors travel fast in combat, even when no one has time to talk. In scraps of shouted updates and half-heard comments between bursts of fire, a picture began to form among the Marines on Iwo Jima's shore. Somebody up there is tearing those bunkers apart. Did you hear that crazy gun? That's not a bar. Stein's out front with that aircraft thing again. To the men hugging the sand, the Stinger became a sound as much as a weapon. It had a distinct rhythm, a savage, continuous roar that cut through the chaotic noise of battle. When they heard it, they knew 2 things. Somewhere ahead, Tony was still alive, and somewhere ahead, the enemy was having a very bad time. For the Japanese defenders, the effect was different, but just as real. They had prepared for American rifles, for light machine guns, for occasional artillery surges. They had not planned for an aircraft-grade machine gun hammering them from ground level, moving and shifting like a predator instead of a fixed turret. To them, it must have sounded like one of the planes had crashed on the beach and decided it wasn't done fighting. The volume of fire suggested more than one gun, more than one man. But again and again, when the Marines advanced behind that storm of bullets, what they found was the same compact figure with the same ugly improvised weapon. In a war full of faceless statistics, the Stinger gave the battle a face. Tony's face. He wasn't a general. He wasn't a strategist. He was one man who had refused to go ashore with only what he was given and had built something terrible for the enemy instead. The enemy wasn't blind. Sooner or later, they were bound to focus on the man causing them so much pain. As Tony shifted positions and poured fire into bunkers and firing points, Japanese riflemen and machine gunners started tracking him, waiting for the moment when he had to move, reload, or adjust. On a battlefield like Iwo Jima, even a legend is one well-placed shot away from silence. At one point in the fighting, a burst of enemy fire stitched the ground around him and slammed into the Stinger itself. Metal sparked and bucked. The impact ripped the weapon from his grip, sending it crashing into the sand a few feet away. For a brief instant, time seemed to slow. The gun lay there, half buried, surrounded by footprints and empty casings, as if the island itself wanted to swallow it. Most men in that moment would have done the sensible thing. Stay down, crawl to cover, wait for someone else to draw fire. Tony did not stay down. He lunged for the stinger, fingers digging into hot, dirty metal as bullets cracked overhead. He yanked it back toward his body, checked it in a heartbeat for catastrophic damage, and brought it up again. The receiver was dented. The finish was scraped. But the heart of the weapon was still beating. He slammed a fresh belt in, locked it, and squeezed the trigger. The stinger roared back to life, as if angry at being interrupted. Later, some Marines would talk about that moment with a mixture of awe and disbelief. The idea of diving for a gun under direct fire and then immediately going back on the offensive sounded insane. But that was Tony's equation. As long as he and the stinger could move and shoot, the enemy didn't get to own that ground. And so, he kept moving, kept shooting, kept reminding everyone on that beach, friend and foe alike, that sometimes the most dangerous thing in a war full of machines is a human being who refuses to let go of his. The beach was only the beginning. Once enough Marines had clawed their way off the sand and carved out a foothold, the battle shifted inland into a world of ridges, ravines, and concrete mouths spitting fire. Iwo Jima was not a flat battlefield. It was a labyrinth with the enemy living inside the rock. Every rise could hide a machine gun. Every cave could hold a squad ready to explode out in a counterattack. The same stubbornness that had held the Japanese in their beach defenses now anchored them in tunnels and fortified positions deeper inside the island. Tony did not retire to the rear once the initial landing phase was over. He moved forward with his unit, taking the stinger into this maze. The same qualities that made the gun a terror on the beach made it invaluable in the inland fight. When a cave entrance started spitting fire, the stinger could drown it in lead in seconds. When a trench line flared to life, Tony could rake it before the defenders even finished their first burst. In tight terrain, every engagement was close, brutal, and short. Sometimes he fired from the shoulder, sometimes from the bipod, sometimes from awkward positions that would have made a rifle useless. The stinger didn't care. If Tony could aim it, it could kill. The cost of that firepower was the same as before: ammunition and exposure. He still had to move under fire to keep the gun fed. He still had to push closer to enemy positions than most sane men would choose. But by now, his comrades had seen what he could do, and their trust in him was absolute. When someone shouted, "Bring up the stinger," they weren't just asking for a weapon, they were asking for Tony, and the will to smash through whatever was in front of them. There is always a last time, though no one knows it while it's happening. For Tony, it came days after that first brutal landing, in the middle of the grinding inch-by-inch fight for the island's interior. The exact details blur in the chaos of war reports and memories. Another push, another fortified point that had to be taken, another moment when someone needed to step out into more fire than any human body was built to handle. What stayed clear was the pattern. Tony was still doing what he had done since the ramp dropped, leading from the front, stinger in hand, turning himself into a moving storm wherever the line threatened to stall. He moved into position, brought the gun up, and unleashed another merciless burst. For a few seconds more, he was once again the sharp edge of the attack, providing the cover and suppression his fellow Marines needed to move, to live, to win ground. Then, enemy fire found him. In that instant, the man who had carried an aircraft gun onto a beach designed to kill him finally paid the price that had been chasing him from the first step. He went down doing exactly what he had chosen to do, putting himself between the enemy and the Marines behind him, trusting that if he could keep firing for just a few seconds longer, they would make it. The line moved on. It had to. War does not pause for heroes. But among the men who had watched him fight, something had changed forever. Because they knew, in a place where death felt random and pointless, that at least one man had spent every last breath on purpose. When the battle for Iwo Jima finally ended, the black sand and broken rock held stories that would never be told. Too many men were gone, their names destined to be just lines on a monument. Tony Stein's name did not disappear into that silence. His actions were witnessed, remembered, and written down in the dry, careful language of military reports. Repeated trips under fire to rescue wounded comrades, personal destruction of enemy positions, extraordinary use of a modified aircraft machine gun in direct ground combat. For his courage and sacrifice, he was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously, the highest military decoration the United States can give. Somewhere in the official citation, there were words about conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. What the citation could not fully capture was the sight of one man sprinting across a killing field over and over, dragging others out while carrying a weapon no one had authorized him to build. The Stinger itself never became standard issue. There was no mass production, no adoption across the Corps. It remained a battlefield improvisation, a strange hybrid remembered in photos, a few surviving parts, and the memories of those who saw what it could do in the right hands. But that is the point. It wasn't just the gun. It was the mindset behind it. In a war dominated by factories, fleets, and vast strategies drawn on maps, Corporal Tony Stein proved something brutally simple. Sometimes, the most decisive advantage is a single soldier who refuses to accept the limits he's been given. A man who looks at a broken aircraft, a discarded weapon, and a near-impossible mission, and decides that if the tools don't exist, he will build them himself. On the black sands of Iwo Jima, among the craters and the bodies and the shattered concrete, one Marine and one illegal, improvised machine gun carved a story that outlived them both. The Japanese couldn't believe he had built a gun from aircraft parts. They believed it when it started firing.